Okay, we've taken a very quick break here just to change the tapes because we're in the midst of a pretty lively story about your father, Charles, and his involvement. He became the president of the American Farm Bureau in what year again?
1954.
Okay, and that was an important year for him in a couple other respects, was it not?
Yes, in the summer of '54, my mother, who had had rheumatic fever as a child, developed very severe heart complications with a series of heart attacks and died in August of 1954. My brothers were still teenage age. I was 12, and it was tough, very horrible time, and awful for my father because my mother was his right hand.
During the time when he was president of the Illinois Farm Bureau, was he traveling or working someplace away from the farm?
Yes, he traveled every Monday morning. He went to the train, whether it was, we still had train service in Sullivan, or later years to Mattoon, went to Chicago, spent the entire working week, either in Chicago or traveling to all the various county farm bureaus, making visits, annual meetings, meeting with their board, making speeches. But most of the time, well, probably about half the time was in Chicago. And then he would come home on Friday night. And my mother was the manager of the home front, essentially. He had rented the farm to George Waykazer, a young man right out of the service, I believe. And my brothers maintained our family livestock, or Angus herd, and had other livestock enterprises, but they were still in high school during that time.
With the passing away of your mother then, did your father consider stopping his work with the Illinois Farm Bureau and coming home?
No, not at that time. Since I was so young, one of my aunts offered, and see, there would about that after a year or so, my brothers all went away to college, and it was just me at home then. And one of my aunts offered to have me come and live with them in northern Illinois, but Dad would hear nothing of it. He hired a lady to be with me, and he continued his IAA work, but just for 3 more months he was with the IAA. By that time, in December of '54, the convention, American Farm Bureau Federation was, and Dad was elected to the presidency. And I remember when he called home, he talked to each one of us by phone, essentially to get our permission to do this. He says, "I will accept this only if you children think I should." And I remember that vividly. He did. It also meant that that it would not change, because the American Farm Bureau offices at that time were in the Merchandise Mart building in Chicago. So he continued his weekly custom. Nothing essentially changed except for my dad's name, for me anyway, except for my dad's name kept popping up in the newspapers and in editorials and farm magazines and so forth. So my life didn't change that much, and neither did Dad's.
What did you say in that phone conversation to
Well,
your dad?
we all said go for it. We knew that my mother would have supported that.
And that's what comforted you?
Mm-hmm.
But it had to be awfully difficult for a 12-year-old girl. I mean, that's an age when most kids are just trying to figure out who they are. And now your mother is gone, and your dad is practically never there.
Well, my dad hadn't been there in my childhood either. The quality that my father had, they say that quality time is more important than quantity. I kind of tend to believe that. Dad was always present when he was there. He was very involved in our lives. We took to having family meetings when he would be home on Sunday. This was also the time he and Mom had decided to purchase this family farm from his parents. This was also the time that had already been initiated, and so he brought us right along with our knowledge and understanding of what was happening. So we felt, all of us, I think, felt a part of the family, and the family meetings helped. But Dad had I was very close to him, in spite of the fact that he had been gone so much of my time, of my youth.
Mm-hmm. So you don't remember any really traumatic experiences during that time frame that you're...
No, other than trying to deal with the loss of our mother.
Yeah, I'm sure
that was traumatic, of course.
How about reading about your dad in newspapers and magazines and radio shows and things like that?
It was a mixed blessing. We were very proud. I was very proud every time Dad's name would be in a newspaper, or every time, by that time television was here, but also I knew that there were lots of people that didn't like my dad, because it was very obvious. If I'd open up a farm magazine, inevitably there was an editorial against Dad. And I knew enough about what was going on, even at that young age, that I knew that that wasn't very nice, and I didn't like that very much. And it gave me a reticence about even bringing my father's name up to people. People knew around here who he was, but I didn't like to mention it, really, that he was, because I didn't know what their thought would be, if they were farm-related.
Can you recall any specifics or a general nature of the criticism he was getting in some of these farm journals and elsewhere?
Well, they just thought that he was misguided, that it was impossible for farmers to exist without government help, and that he was just going down the wrong track. I remember it popped up in the most unusual way. One night I was reading late at night, and my bedroom happened to be towards the front of the house, so there was a light on. It was before air conditioning, so the windows were open. And a car, we're talking midnight or later, drove by the house, and someone yelled out obscenities that I could hear very clearly against my father. It was just things like that, out of the blue, that really got to you, and it was kind of shook you up.
Well, let's talk about a little bit more in detail about his presidency, if you will, at the Illinois Farm Bureau. He was president for how long?
From 48 to 54.
And during that time frame, no, I thought he was, okay.
You said Illinois Farm Bureau,
that's right,
yeah.
I'm sorry. American Farm Bureau.
American Farm Bureau from 54 to 1970, I believe, is when he resigned.
71?
71, maybe. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And did he travel more then? Did he travel around the entire country?
Oh, yeah, and foreign countries. And he was very much involved in the national politics at that time. He frequently was called, every time there was a new farm bill or new changes or whatever, there were congressional hearings, and he had to testify, of course, all the time. He met with the presidents, all of the presidents at various times from Truman on. He was very well acquainted with and met he had many private meetings with Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon. I'm not sure beyond that, but he was very much involved in traveling. In fact, he would always, no matter where he was, he would call home on Wednesday night. And so our phone bill was always interesting. But he, I know, traveled in every state in the Union several times to various Farm Bureau activities.
Was the American Farm Bureau, I mean, this huge organization with, what, 1.5 million members?
Mm-hmm,
and I know it was larger than the Grange or the
it was the
Farmers
largest
Union.
farmers organization in the country.
Was there any difference of opinion within the American Farm Bureau?
Oh, yes. I wasn't intimately involved with knowledge about all of that, but I know that there were the Farm Bureau wasn't settled as in the direction that my dad led it when he first started. It was sort of in a state of flux. Earl Smith, who in Illinois, who had preceded him in Illinois, was very much cooperated with the New Deal at first, but I think he had a transition at some point. Then Allen Klein, who was the preceding president of the American Farm Bureau before my father, was very much a free marketer. So Dad kind of stepped right into a direction that Farm Bureau had already started to go when he became president.
So most of the friction was with other farmers' organizations and political forces?
Oh, well, that's the friction I remember most vividly. It was, I think, it's just a nightmare when I think about some of the things that happened from other farm organizations, and it was vicious at times.
Mm-hmm. Did you have conversations with your dad about all the negative press that he sometimes drew?
Well, he would bring up some of it, not so much in the family. He'd always come home and teach Sunday school for the high school kids in our church, the Methodist church here in Sullivan, and one of those kids would inevitably ask him, what did he do that week? And so here he was, standing there in front of the kids, and sometimes he'd tell about some of the conflict. He did, it wasn't so much negative press. I think he kind of expected that, because just like today, editorialists are in their own thing, and you know what they're going to do. It was I think he was bothered by individuals more than the private man more than anything.
Would it be fair to say, though, that he liked to mix it up?
He never shirked away from it. I think he would have been much happier had people agreed with him, but he probably did like a fight. I don't know.
Do you think he lost a lot of sleep because of these
Not a bit. I don't think so.
Did you?
After I was older, I worried about it quite a bit. Especially there was a death threat to my dad at one time. And I don't remember the details of it, but it was in a local county farm bureau that he had spoken to, and their local people told Dad that they had received some threats. So he and my stepmother, Dad remarried my wonderful stepmother Mabel, and she was with him at the time. So the local leaders, and I believe the local sheriff, escorted him out of town, and he told us about that, and Mabel told. And from that moment on, I really was uneasy. The feelings were very hot. Just very hot.
Was that in the 1960s by that time?
Yeah.
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit more about how he met his second wife then, how he met Mabel?
Oh, Mabel, bless her heart. She was a legal secretary working in Chicago, and her parents lived at Watseka, or Milford actually. And it was in the habit of going down from Chicago to see them on a weekend now and then, and it happened to be that Dad was on the Meadowlark, which is a little train that came to Sullivan, and she was. And they were sitting in the dining car, and there was a curve that was kind of rough for the train to get around, and he'd seen people thrown off the stool in the dining car. So he struck up a conversation with her. She was sitting next to him, to warn her that she might be in danger coming up. And so they met that way, and he ultimately asked her for her phone number. She said, I don't understand why on earth I ever did that. I never ever did it before, but I gave him my phone number. And the next thing we knew, we had a new stepmother in our family, and they were married in 1956, and then they had a child, George, in 1958, her only child.
So your half-brother.
My half-brother.
Was she quite a bit younger than your father?
She was about, I think about 11 years younger.
Okay.
Beautiful woman.
How old was he at the time that he remarried?
He would have married in 56, so he would have been 49, I guess.
Okay. So she had waited quite a long time before your father came along, too,
Yes, and was a competent legal secretary. She was the secretary for one of Illinois' state senators at the time, with whom Dad was acquainted. So that was another one of their things in common. But one of the things about Mabel, she became, especially after Dad retired, she became sort of not only his wife, but his personal secretary. And Dad, after his retirement, wouldn't have been able to have accomplished near what he did in his retirement without Mabel's able assistance. She would take dictation and type letters and do all sorts of things.
Now, you were a teenager, about ready to graduate from high school, or just graduated when they got married again?
Yes, I was 16 or 14.
Okay.
14.
So a little bit younger than that.
Yeah.
So, do you accept her readily as a new mother?
Now, what do you think?
Well, from everything you've said so far, absolutely.
I liked her from the moment I saw her, which certainly helped. But what happened was Dad married her, and then here we were. My brothers were in college, and it was just me and Mabel on the farm for 5 days a week until Dad got home. So being a teenager, I was a typical teenager and quite a little stinker, I'm sure. And so Dad would come home, and if we'd had difficulties that week, which we did sometimes, he would patch them up and everything would be smooth. But when little George was born, she and I had something in common that we both dearly loved, and I treasured having a little brother, and it drew us together very much. And she's the most anyone would ever want in a stepmother. She's a lovely person.
Can you remember any specific incidents? And well, we were off camera here where we were talking about the Wheat Referendum, and maybe that's indicative of the kind of struggles your dad was in. Can you talk about that in any detail?
Well, it seemed to all of this strife over what direction agriculture would lead seemed to come to a head involved with around the Wheat Referendum, which I believe was during Kennedy's administration. And it was an attempt to increase, I guess, some of the restrictions. I'm not really sure of the details of the Wheat Referendum. All I know is that it became kind of a symbol for farmers to focus on. It was sort of a symbol of what direction the government would take. Farm Bureau came out avidly against it, and several of the other smaller organizations, I think I was just reading the other day that the Ranchers Association came out against it, and a number of other things. But anyway, it was practicing farmers were given the option to vote on this, what direction. And they defeated the Wheat Referendum, much to the amazement and shock of the Kennedy administration and many of the congressmen supporting it, also of many farm organizations. And I would say that after that defeat, well, one of the things that resulted in, I've been holding this magazine copy, Dad's...
you can hold it steady here for just a minute or so.
Dad's, the Time magazine did a cover story on Dad, and featured what was going on with the Wheat Referendum. Not only that, I mean, that was probably one of the things that brought him to the attention of the national media. He had already been very much well known you see, back in those days there were many more farmers than there are today. And the farm program, the money spent on the farm program was a pretty large chunk of the budget, the national budget. And so today, if a farmer does something, it doesn't get much notice. But in those days, it was still a huge part of our economy.
What's the date on that magazine?
September 3rd, 1965.
And so September of 1965, Johnson's president by that time. So you've got his War on Poverty program, which is expensive, very expensive. The war in Vietnam's heating up, and that was very expensive. And these farm programs are very expensive. And I'm sure part of the dialogue at that time was, we can't afford to do all of this stuff.
Just as it is today.
Yeah, just as it is today. And I'm sure your father had some views about Johnson's War on Poverty program as well. You remember him expressing any views on that?
I remember his comments about Johnson. Of course, I do know what his attitude towards the war on poverty was also, which, as you may guess, being of his nature, he believed that with help, a bit of help, people can get on their feet, and he hoped that our government would support in more of an independent spirit. But I do know that one of the first meetings he had with Johnson, he said he had never heard a president, any of the presidents he knew, who had such foul language. He could hardly utter a sentence without an expletive. So,
did your dad get the famous Johnson treatment?
To see his operation scar, you mean, or what?
Well, where Johnson gets up close and starts leaning in and uses every trick he can to kind of use his weight and influence somebody in his direction. The powerful personality that Lyndon Johnson was.
He may have, but it didn't affect. I don't believe it affected Dad much. Johnson was courteous to Dad. Don't misunderstand me. He was, and as was Kennedy. He one of the things that one of his other memories, that's probably off the subject, but I remember Dad coming home when his first meeting with Kennedy, and by that time his rocker was quite famous, and they were having their chat with Kennedy was sitting in the rocker, and they were having a good visit. But Johnson prided himself on being a country boy, you know, a rancher, and so they did have some empathy, I think, some common ground. It wasn't totally a...
But I would suspect that your father would occasionally use words like socialist programs of the...
I'm not sure that he ever did...
association with Lyndon Johnson's program.
Oh, of course. If you ever read any of his editorials through that time period, socialism is one of his biggest causes that he was working against. And yes, he did view Johnson's programs as socialist.
And I'm sure Johnson didn't appreciate that.
I doubt if he did, but I think Johnson was of the nature, as I recall, he was used to the give and take, being the majority leader of the Senate prior to being president. And I think that's just part of his day.
So, continuing on here, what happened to you when you graduated from high school?
I went to the University of Illinois and ultimately majored in the teaching of history and social studies.
Well, you departed somewhat from the family tradition then.
I also departed in another way. I went on after I taught school for a short period. I ultimately became an artist. I'm a watercolor artist, which is totally out of character to my family. There's never been too many art. Well, I had a great aunt, Bertha, was an artist.
Did you stay in the local area, though?
Yes, I married my high school classmate, Roger Roney. We farm north of Sullivan.
Okay, so I take it back. You didn't get too far away from the family traditions.
No, I didn't.
Farming and teaching.
That's right.
From everything you've said.
That's right.
Okay. And how many acres does your husband have?
Well, we farm about not quite 1,000. We own some and rent some.
Anything else that you recall especially vividly about the time frame when your father was really in the limelight as the president of the American Farm Bureau?
I recall mostly how proud I was of him and how honored I felt to be his daughter. And that's carried with me through all these years. He's been gone now almost 10 years, died in 1999. He was an example that anyone could look at and with great, not only pride, but respect. The one thing I would never ever do as I grew up would be to disappoint him. And that I had seen his suffering and mainly with the grieving over my mother's death, and I would never have done anything to add any more agony to his life. I credit him with my Christian faith. I credit him with my determination to see our country continue in my small ways that I can in the right direction. I credit him with my value system. He was a great man.
And he stepped down from being president, I think, in 1971, but he hardly retired in the classic sense of the term, did he?
No.
What did he do after that?
Well, he started raising hogs. He converted our old chicken house into a hog nursery and a farrowing house. And he and my brother, little brother George, had that as an enterprise. Mm-hmm. But then he got involved with being on various boards. He was on the Illinois Power Board. He was on the Illinois Board of Regents, which supervises a group of at that time a group of the colleges in the country. He was on the Millikan Board of Directors. He became very involved in the Methodist Church politics, the behind the scenes, the conference. He attended a delegate to the General Conference. He took very seriously, not only in farm politics, but in personal life, fighting against things that he thought were destructive of our way of life. And the Methodist Church he had plenty to be upset about. And
so he was at odds with the general philosophy of some in the Methodist Church?
Yes, the social gospel movement, which was very, very, very prominent, which he believed, as I interpreted, that it led people away from the emphasis on simple faith and being a practicing Christian. He'd write, he was a thorn in the side of the Methodist.
But proud to be that thorn?
Letters. I've got a file, or I've seen a copy of his agitation letters. He was always firing, or editorials. He also wrote for our County Sullivan newspaper a series of weekly articles called Way Back When. In fact, I haven't mentioned what a good writer he was. He wrote editorials every month for his entire life in Farm Bureau, and they were I always felt they were very well composed. Mm-hmm. He was a good writer and speaker.
And he wrote his memoirs too, did he not?
He wrote his memoirs.
How old was he when he finished those?
He was probably 89 or 90, something like that. He'd had a serious health incident, and then so he really got serious about writing some things down. But his memoirs were not so much about his fights in Farm Bureau as just sort of a general observation, and a lot about family things that he'd experienced.
But written in the same very colorful, fluid style that he was known for?
Very much.
I think he also had a little bit of a controversy when he worked on the Regents, the Board of Regents.
Probably, as I recall, it was over tenure, probably. Teacher tenure. You've done your research, haven't you?
We tried to. I think I can guess what side he came down on the teacher tenure issue.
Yeah, you can. Once again, believing that if people are left to their own devices, they are competent, and that you shouldn't have extra help that becomes a crutch. And it kind of follows through, if you recall. Mm-hmm. I have one funny experience about that. I have some very good friends who are artists at the Eastern Illinois University, and one day one of them was moaning and groaning about this super conservative member of the Illinois Regents. And I said, "Oh, what's his name?" And he says, "Charles Shuman." And I said, "Well, he's my father." So,
the conversation took a dramatic turn after that?
He didn't talk about it anymore.
How about that? Well, let's just kind of ask some general questions. Looking back, and you've already expressed how proud you were about your dad's career. What do you think his greatest accomplishment was?
Being a dad. That's my attitude. He was tops.
Do you think he left a legacy in the Farm Bureau as well?
Oh, yeah, but I'm afraid they are, it's not as, oh my goodness, it's been, since the farm program started, it has been 70 years, and we are still not where Dad would have liked.
He didn't pass away that long ago. What year was it?
99.
What would he say today?
I think he would continue. He got a glimmer of hope back, I forget which farm bill it was changed the emphasis maybe my brother can speak more to that, but he had a little hope. But you know what? He always knew that politicians were going to mess things up. He had a very low opinion of politicians. And I think he was the kind of guy, well, I'll believe it when I see it. And it hasn't happened yet.
But just these last few years, there's been such incredible changes in agriculture in the United States, and much of it is driven by market forces.
Correct.
You've got ethanol production, which is really putting, you would think if ever there was a time that free market might be able to work, this would be the time. And ethanol production, what's going on in China and India and the rest of the developing
things are
world.
really changing. A person might point out that ethanol, though, is still has a major support system from the government to
subsidies.
Maintain it.
Absolutely.
But yes, there are some possibilities, but I don't know. I have, my husband and I have talked about this a lot. I don't know how pertinent this is, but even today, what I think is what we see happening are larger farmers cash renting large blocks of land in central Illinois. I've not seen this until the last 10 years or so to this extent. I'm talking about 20,000, 30,000 acres that some of these people farm. They pay huge, high cash rents. Now, why are they able to do that? They have the security of the insurance programs. They know that they're not going to get caught out on the limb. And the government is, in a way, I know that many other factors have led to the diminution of the numbers of farmers. But these large landowners are going to push out all of the smaller farmers. Now today the small farm is 1,000 acres, and it's provides competition. They're just protected.
Well, you've just touched on a little bit about, but what do you see as the future of what we used to know as the classic family farm?
Well, a lot of these large farmers are still family farms. They have their whole family involved in the farming, so it's kind of hard to know unless, an argument could be made it's still a family farm. There are farms that are corporations simply because the entity works better for their management or for tax purposes. But unlike California, where you really do see a lot of corporate farming, but I frankly don't know, and one of the things my husband and I talk about it a lot. I'm very happy to see that my two nephews, my brother Paul's two sons, are back, both farming here, the family farm, and I really believe that farmers who are about to pass on into the happy land of retirement should really help young farmers get a hold. But it's so different even from when we started farming. I'm not a fortune teller, I don't know.
Well, gosh, I was just going to ask you one more question. And you say that. My last question was going to be, are you optimistic about the future for farming? Do you think your dad would be?
Yeah, I am very optimistic. It's hard to mess up the best ground on the face of the earth unless we do some really stupid things in the interest of more energy use. The thing that I am really concerned about, my husband and I especially, are, you see, this area of the Midwest, this area of Illinois, does have the richest soil on the earth. The glacier made it rich. Underneath is coal, and the modern method of coal mining is called the Longwall Method. And it comes through and they take the coal out, and then the soil collapses above it. And it's to me a danger of what might happen with this productive farmland. I hope we'll have the sense to take care of it, because as long as that ground is out there, it'll provide for us if we take care of it.
Well, thank you very much, Janet. This has been a wonderful interview, and I love to hear the stories about that goes back almost two centuries. And
thank you. It's been a pleasure too.
Thank you.